It really is a strange time to be alive. A new FromSoftware game is out, even if it's just an expansion, and for the first time in what seems like forever, fan response to the game is very different than it ever has been. The backlash from the naysayers has been intense, as has the praise from the Defense Force. People are happy, people are sad, and the discussion around it all refuses to cool down. It's been 2 years since FromSoftware released Elden Ring, and after those 2 years, the company has released what has to be their most expansive and ambitious DLC, or to term it more appropriately, expansion to date. Shadow of the Erdtree came out around a month ago, and the opinions of people who've played the game have really been in two rather interesting camps. Some people, as expected, really love the game, as it seems to give them the same experience as their first playthrough of the base game of Elden Ring from 2 years ago. That camp, the first camp, is the happy camp. They're satisfied, excited, happy, and all is right with the world as far as they're concerned. Then, there's the other side. The side that feels like Elden Ring, Shadow of the Erdtree is a significant step down from the base game, and are shocked at how unfulfilled and empty they're feeling from a game that they clearly expected to love. This is the camp of the heartbroken, the sad, and the disappointed. Now what's interesting is that both camps consist of fans of the base game of Elden Ring. It's the fan base, the people who really connected with Elden Ring, that are feeling this divided and split about an expansion to a game that they all clearly loved. Yet, even in its day, Elden Ring was not a game for the masses, nor did its success happen because it catered to all of even FromSoftware's previous fans. In a fairly recent interview with The Guardian, series creator and FromSoftware head honcho Hidetaka Miyazaki stated something rather interesting to this point. He says, if we really wanted the whole world to play the game, we could just crank the difficulty down more and more, but that wasn't the right approach. Had we taken that approach, I don't think the game would have done what it did, because the sense of achievement that players gain from overcoming these hurdles is such a fundamental part of the experience. Turning down difficulty would strip the game of that joy, which in my eyes would break the game itself. This quote was in reference to difficulty, but the idea here is clear. While Miyazaki wants a lot of people to play and enjoy his game, he's going for a very specific experience and a sense of accomplishment for those that do choose to engage with his game. Yet, what's perhaps most interesting and a bit weird about Shadow of the Erdtree is that it's actually a game that seems to be alienating a decent chunk of the very same players that seem to really love and vibe with the kind of experience in the base game of Elden Ring that he's talking about. So the question is, or the questions rather, are why is that? Why do some people love Shadow of the Erdtree? Why do some people really dislike it? Is it the game's fault? Is it too hard? Are some people just too nostalgic for Elden Ring's base game, and that's coloring their perceptions of the DLC? Those are the questions that I've really been struggling with in this past month, as I actually found myself in the disappointed camp for the game, despite being beyond hyped for the game before its release and getting that $300 collector's edition for what was essentially a $40 expansion pack. Now, despite my personal overall disappointment with Shadow of the Erdtree, there were definitely moments and aspects of the game that really did appeal to me, even if the overall experience by the end felt a bit sour. So I get where people who truly enjoyed the game are coming from. There are aspects of Shadow of the Erdtree that under the right circumstances can lead to the same level of a transformative experience that the base game of Elden Ring was and provided. Yet, what's fascinating and kind of strange is how narrow and limited those circumstances and the scope of people that they cater to are. And so, for the first time in what seems like forever, FromSoftware has, at least for a sizable chunk of its audience, hit a bit of a wall. It wouldn't be a stretch to say that for those who were disappointed, FromSoftware has failed at making an experience and taking on the challenge of providing those fans of Elden Ring with their next big, awesome experience. So really, That's what I want to focus in on today. What decisions and challenges did FromSoftware face with Shadow of the Erdtree? And how did those decisions and challenges ultimately affect the enjoyment of those familiar with their games? Where does FromSoftware go from here? Is this a fluke or a momentary misstep? Or is Shadow of the Erdtree an indication of the future of FromSoftware's games? Let's dive in and really examine the various changes, upgrades, additions, and the DLC as a whole, and break down what makes Shadow of the Erdtree so divisive. Now, before we jump in, I will warn you. Like most of the videos on this channel, there are full spoilers ahead for Elden Ring and Shadow of the Erdtree. So if you haven't beaten both, then viewer discretion is advised. So, to start off, I think it's worth noting just what kind of a situation FromSoftware was in when they sat down to make and design Shadow of the Erdtree. This may seem like a no-duh fact, but DLCs and expansions are fundamentally different from entirely new games or even sequels to established games and series of games. A DLC or expansion is smaller in scope and price, but it also has to embody the spirit and the experience of its base game. More of the same is the bare minimum here. But where it gets complicated is with an RPG-like, massively open-world game like Elden Ring. See, most people accessing Shadow of the Erdtree are basically at least 100+ hours into the base game. The way this expansion is gated requires you to face 2 optional bosses, one of which is basically a late-game boss unless you perform some weird hijinks to shortcut your way to him. So, in essence, this is an expansion for people who've, as a starting point, played Elden Ring extensively at least once. For me, that meant spending around a good 200+ hours in the base game, basically doing everything I could before I got to Shadow of the Erdtree. Some people may have mainlined the base game, while others might have been on New Game Plus or played the game multiple times. The point is, FromSoftware is making a game not for players starting from scratch, but for veterans and people fairly familiar with their game's systems, mechanics, and design. People are, at the very least, competent and decent at the game, and have found their method and style for how they approach and play the very open-ended nature of Elden Ring's various bosses, exploration, enemies, and problems that the game provides. And therein lies the biggest and newest challenge, one that I think no developer has ever truly conquered. How do you design a game that gives that same sense of wonder, discovery, and accomplishment for a player base that's lived and breathed your game? How do you cater to all the different builds, playstyles, and approaches that players have taken to finish the base game, and then give them an experience that allows them to do more of the same while still feeling fresh, unique, and challenging? That is, interestingly, the challenge that FromSoftware took upon themselves when they spent the last 2 years making Shadow of the Erdtree. And it just can't be understated how difficult of a challenge that really was. Unlike the base game of Elden Ring, where all players start with a base set of possible permutations for what you'd call a starting character, Shadow of the Erdtree's player base is going to be staggeringly more diverse. On one side, you've got your build specialists. The bonk builds, the dex builds, the parry builds, the status builds, your bleed, frost, poison, death root. And then on the other side, you've got your mages, and then the hybrid builds, and those crazy challenge run players that use a level 1 character to beat everything. And with all of that, throw in the fact that some people are using summons, of which there are many types. Some people play the game cooperatively, some play solo, and you've got such a diverse bunch of players to target that I honestly think it was a losing proposition to begin with. To that point, it's easy to say that it would have been much easier to have gone back to zero. That is, just starting players off with a new game. So yeah, that's the first thing worth pointing out. The first reason why I think Shadow of the Erdtree is so divisive. It's an expansion instead of what it should have been, a full-blown sequel. There's actually a staggering amount of and scale to the content here for what is essentially a $40 expansion pack. At around 35 to 40 hours of content, Shadow of the Erdtree is bigger and more packed with content than a lot of full-priced games today. And yet, for all its scale and heft, I really do think it's the fact that Shadow of the Erdtree is an expansion that holds it back. There's the aforementioned issue with the player base starting at different points, and crafting a balanced experience for all of them being a nightmare in and of itself. But there's other stuff too. Since this is an expansion, it can't significantly deviate or add too much new stuff to the base game, nor can it ignore the fact that most players have already experienced a lot of the variety and content of the base game. Shadow of the Erdtree has to also feel a lot more refined and embody the essence of what made Elden Ring so good, that combination of freedom, exploration, discovery, and challenge, and it has to do so without having too many new tools or tricks at its disposal. Then there's also the fact that the tech powering the game is now 2 years old, and has to be largely reused. Now, clever reuse of assets and engines has always been a FromSoftware staple, but what can be retooled and remixed in a sequel has to basically stay the same in an expansion, which ultimately can limit the scope and vision of whatever it is you're making. Finally, there's the story and lore expectations of players. FromSoftware has spawned a whole cottage industry of lore experts and archaeologists on YouTube, and a big part of the fun of engaging with their games is the journey that players go on to discover the secrets of the worlds that FromSoftware crafts. For a lot of those players, FromSoftware has to provide more narrative answers and questions to satiate that sense of wonder and potential for crafting theory and interpreting events. Again, this is easier to do in a sequel, where you can take some threads from the previous game, but ultimately you can expand out and explore a new set of core themes and ideas. An expansion, on the other hand, is more or less expected to help tie up loose ends, wrap up missing ideas or questions, and generally is a lot more limited in what players will want from it. And expectation is, I think, the core of the issue with Shadow of the Erdtree. It's no secret that FromSoftware is viewed as the near top of the video games industry. They're the best at third-person RPG-based action games. They've inspired other exceptional games like Neo, Lies of P, and even Stellar Blade. Yet, for all the competition that they have and have inspired, FromSoftware, with Elden Ring in particular, are known to have crafted a transcendent experience. It's the sort of game that everyone needs to at least try. So, when you jump into the next part of Elden Ring, then you're expecting to be blown away. You're expecting to get something that's magical, life-changing, and earth-shattering. An experience like what you got 2 years ago. And as we've covered up till now, there's a lot of odds stacked against achieving that particular goal, even for FromSoftware. So yeah, it's not surprising that a good chunk of players just didn't get what they were looking for. The obvious idea of expectations being too high is definitely true here. The people who've kept their hype in check or have had experience with FromSoftware's DLC offerings in the past are probably a good chunk of the loved it crowd. But, and this is a big but, I don't think it's just expectations that make Shadow of the Erdtree a disappointment for all the rest. There are certain decisions beyond just deciding to make a full sequel-sized expansion that can lead to disappointment. Those decisions have to do with the core pillars of the Elden Ring experience: player freedom, exploration, and difficulty. All things that the base game of Elden Ring excels at, and for one reason or the other, that Shadow of the Erdtree can either hit or really miss depending on who's playing it and why. Let's tackle exploration first, as that's the most independent of the other two. which are more intertwined and kind of feed into one another. What made exploration in Elden Ring such a joy was the fact that the game provided an ample amount of space for you to navigate, traverse, and explore, and then provided significant and meaningful rewards for that exploration. The rewards varied from a cool new place to see visually, a bunch of enemies to fight, armor and weapons to grab, NPCs to meet, story tidbits to discover, and of course, getting stronger while doing all of that by simply engaging with this loop of exploration and the combat. Where Elden Ring kind of really struck an excellent balance of giving you a variety of things to see, discover, find, and use, Shadow of the Erdtree really switches up the formula to some detrimental results. The easiest example of this is in the Scadutree Fragments, and the whole way in which Shadow of the Erdtree handles both character progression and your overall progression in the campaign itself. Instead of organically collecting runes as you engage with all the other aspects of the game, Shadow of the Erdtree has you basically go on a scavenger hunt to find these items called Scadutree Fragments that significantly power you up but only affect you in the DLC's area itself. The reason for this decision is probably obvious, in that it's done to segment out the DLC and the base game without having one completely break or affect the other. In the past, players have brought their maxed out characters to FromSoftware's DLC offerings and kind of breezed through it all. That sense of progression from the base games just hasn't been there, because there's really nowhere to progress from hitting the absolute max power level of your character. So really, FromSoftware basically had two choices here. Either reset the player back to zero and depower them, something that would have definitely not gone over well given how much effort and time players have invested in their characters, or create some kind of new mechanic to make leveling up in the DLC kind of separate from the base game. Simply raising the level cap and therefore increasing the number values for stats wasn't a valid enough solution here, if only because of the fact that FromSoftware wanted players to be able to expand the base game experience with the content from their DLC. Again, this whole problem is a self-inflicted one that comes from the fact that Shadow of the Erdtree is an expansion and thus has to expand the base game in some meaningful way. But the actual solution here is a bit of an odd one, because what the Scadutree Fragments do is basically give you a fixed percentage buff to your attack and defense, and that buff is actually fairly significant. Yet, the whole issue with this system is that players are free to engage with it as much as they want, and the game doesn't really indicate how much or how little of it you should engage with. It's entirely possible, for instance, to gather all of the Scadutree Fragments before facing any of the DLC's major bosses. But to do that, you really need to use a guide and make sure you don't trigger certain events and bosses. Or you can try and find as many fragments as you can and try to face a boss and progress the game, dealing with whatever level of power you end up with. The issue here is that since you can basically gather all or none of the fragments, the appropriate level or amount of fragments is kind of a mystery. How much is too much? How much is too little? It's up to the player to manage that for themselves. And given how important and significant the buffs from the Scadutree Fragments are, you're in a world of hurt if you don't eventually gather them all. Most normal enemies in the game can one-shot you at the beginning, and even after you've gotten as much as half of the available fragments, you can still have bosses 1 or 2 hit kill you in certain situations. We'll talk about difficulty in a bit, but there's a bigger set of issues with the Scadutree Fragment system. 1, some of them are exceedingly well hidden, and 2, there's a very small number of them without any extras. If you remember the golden seeds item in the base game that allowed you to expand your flask, then you remember that the game gave you a bit too many of them, and you could easily max out your healing flasks without having to collect them all. In Shadow of the Erdtree, your entire character's power progression is tied to specific hidden items, and you need to basically make sure to not miss any of them or you won't be able to max yourself out. And if the game's difficulty and bosses say anything, it's that you want to be as powerful as possible. What this leads to is really having to comb every inch of Shadow of the Erdtree's map in excruciating detail to make sure you're significantly powered up. Scadutree Fragments are found in obvious places like the various Mikola crosses that are strewn about the map, or in certain ghost-like enemies as drops, or from certain bigger mini-bosses littered on the map, or in hidden areas as well. Thus, without a guide or a lot of persistence, your progression is tied to really mopping up every inch of the map and being very thorough. But here's the other issue with mopping up the map, as it were. The other rewards, besides progression, aren't all that great either when compared to the base game. In the base game of Elden Ring, you had a plethora of spells, equipment, items, and upgrade materials to find, making combing the world map a rather fun and interesting experience. In Shadow of the Erdtree, there's a definite lack of things to find. Shadow of the Erdtree introduces a bunch of new weapon types, yet you basically can only find one or two variants of each weapon type. Some are random drops from enemies too, so finding a really great weapon is a fairly rare affair. And given the fact that your build and style of play is pretty locked in at this point, there's really not a ton of weapons that you can engage with without completely respeccing or adjusting your character. And this is a real tragedy, because if there's one thing that Shadow of the Erdtree really improves and expands upon when compared to the base game of Elden Ring, it's in the new weapons. All these new weapon types add a new dimension to the gameplay for one, whether it's martial arts and hand-to-hand combat, throwable weapons, or some really nice upgrades and additions to dual-wielding weapons via those newer weapon types. Yet the biggest advancement is in the Ash of War system, where the new skills and moves that you get just blend even more seamlessly into your base moveset for each weapon. Base Elden Ring had this issue where your Ash of War basically provided you with the one attack, the one skill that was your strongest and best move. There was little need or much of an incentive to use the base attacks or moves because the Ash of War's skill was generally stronger, faster, and did more damage. Think Rivers of Blood and its Corpse Piler skill, for instance, where bleed builds would basically spam that skill attack, and that was basically their build. They just had to make sure to conserve stamina and have enough FP to continue using it. The newer weapons in Shadow of the Erdtree are different, in that the Ash of War moves actually mesh well and integrate with the base moveset. A great example of this idea is in the new backhand blades, which give you a new dodge and then attack move called Blind Spot. This move gives you iframes, but can also extend and be a part of the weapon's normal attack combo strings. The skill is a move that is in addition to your toolset and can be an integral part of it, but it's just one moveset in your arsenal. Another solid example is in the Wing Stance Ash of War. When combined with a weapon like the Milady, you can create this elegant hit and run playstyle that does massive damage in short, quick bursts. There are many options like this, and this is the one thing that seems like it really provided something new and expansive to the base systems of Elden Ring. Which again is why it's such a darn shame that most players will either only gravitate to one or two new weapons that fit their builds, or will avoid the new weapons entirely, missing on what is likely the best new piece of content in this expansion. So, the only other things to find, besides weapons and some new armor sets, are upgrade materials, respec materials, and crafting recipes. Yep, that's it. And again, depending on your character's state and how you engaged with the base game before starting the DLC, these things can really vary in terms of their value and therefore reward to you as a player. For people who've used up their upgrade materials and really experimented with a lot of weapons in the base game, this abundance of upgrade materials is probably a godsend. But For the people who stuck to a particular build and only tried a few weapons, you're bound to have a ton of upgrade materials already at your disposal. So maxing out 1 or 2 weapons that mesh with your build or playstyle in the DLC is already fairly easy. This really is another interesting choice, because it most definitely is supposed to account for the fact that players may either not have the proper vendors or NPCs in the base game to buy upgrade materials from, or may have run out. It's a solution, sure, but one that caters to a very specific set of players and outright bores or alienates the rest. The respeccing items are in a pretty similar situation, in that I, for example, had a good chunk of 18 to 20 respecs at my disposal from the base game, so finding another 5 to 10 in Shadow of the Erdtree really didn't do much for me. Then there's the crafting recipes or cookbooks. Again, crafting is one of those mechanics or systems that most people in the base game have either entirely avoided or barely touched depending on their build. If you were an archer, for instance, then you'd likely be crafting arrows and stuff, but otherwise, most melee builds would rarely touch the crafting system. Giving crafting recipes as a reward for exploration, therefore, just doesn't do it for a good chunk of the player base that isn't interested in that particular system. So, in essence, rewards for exploration in terms of finding things are a mixed bag. Progression is a mixed bag. So what's left? Well, 2 things, I'd say. In that there's virtual tourism or traversal, and there's enemy encounters or enemy variety. These are the last 2 rewards that players will be expecting from the base game of Elden Ring, and Shadow of the Erdtree unfortunately may very well disappoint there as well. Enemy variety is an easy one to cover, in that Shadow of the Erdtree doesn't litter its huge expansive map with enough different new enemies and actually reuses a bunch of enemies from the base game. Whereas in the base game, each area of the rather expansive map had its own distinct identity with its own wildlife, monsters, and look and feel, Shadow of the Erdtree will either reuse monsters from the base game or reuse the few new enemies that it does have throughout multiple areas. To make matters worse, unlike the base game, there are huge chunks of the map in Shadow of the Erdtree that are just empty. There's these really cool atmospheric and really artful spaces that Shadow of the Erdtree's map has, but there just isn't anything in them. There's no quests, no new items or things to find, and just a few of the same enemies without even any major bosses or eventful things to do. The whole Finger Ruins maze-like area is perhaps the biggest victim of this, with one new enemy type coupled with those hand enemies from the base game filling the entire gigantic area. And what do you do in this area? Really nothing much other than ring a bell as part of one NPC questline, and then you basically call it good. There's no boss battle here, there's no diverse set of enemies to fight, a puzzle to solve, or some cool sets of items to collect. In the end, the whole place ends up feeling dead and empty. Now, from an atmospheric perspective, it definitely works, giving the whole area a lonely, forgotten, lost type of vibe. But it doesn't make for engaging exploration or gameplay. And unfortunately, there's multiple areas like this in the game, where there's nothing really to do or find, and there's large swaths of empty space where you'll either find 1 or 2 enemy types or a recycled set of enemies or field bosses to encounter. There's just not enough enemy variety to keep things fresh, and the traversal and locations themselves just don't provide enough to make going through them feel rewarding or worthwhile, even if they look and feel really cool. And speaking of traversal, that brings us to the final issue with exploration. And that's in how Shadow of the Erdtree's map is built and constructed. For a lot of people who loved the expansion, the big selling point here is the layering and the verticality of it all. And that part of the map is really darn impressive. At multiple points in the expansion, you can see areas both above and below you. And those are indeed areas that you can just ultimately explore and visit. The readability and interconnectiveness of it all isn't just clever, it's impressive in every sense of the world. This is a world that feels like it's just the most interconnected, magical place and has tons of landmarks and highlights that just lead you throughout the entire space. So yeah, for those who are impressed with the sheer level design of how things are stacked on top of each other and connected, I totally get it. I've been a level designer myself and feel like I'm looking at the work of a true master. But even this master, it seems, leaves a few rough edges here and there. The issue I have with this interconnected, layered, cleverly designed map is in its central nexus point and the major funnel that connects everything together, the legacy dungeon known as the Shadow Keep. Simply put, the way the map of Shadow of the Erdtree is designed, everything connects to, leads to, and flows out of the Shadow Keep. The Shadow Keep is the largest legacy dungeon in the DLC. It has multiple exits, both to optional areas and optional bosses, and has the game's major progression wall in Mesmer the Impaler. And it also gives you the path to the expansion's final area and boss in the Rao Ruins. What this means is that in order to fully explore and reach most of the DLC, you have to pass through the Shadow Keep and potentially risk locking yourself out of huge swaths of content should you progress through it in the wrong order and accidentally trigger something like Mesmer. But hey, let's say you do manage to find the optional exits. The process is basically going through the Shadow Keep, leaving through one of the side exits, doing an area, coming back, doing more of the Shadow Keep, finding another area, rinse and repeat until you've done all the side content, and then you get to finish the keep before progressing to the final area. Is this possible without a guide? I don't think so. Is it still easy to mess up with the guide? Sure. And the fact that you are definitely, repeatedly forced to go through the game's central area that can ultimately progress the DLC story is, I think, a recipe for disaster. And this decision also renders all the layering and verticality of the map kind of moot, since you're basically stuck in a giant tower without really seeing it as a giant tower. Again, the freedom of exploration and even the discovery of new areas feels a lot more disappointing than it even should because of how each of the DLC's areas are all connected through one central location. It's in stark contrast to, say, how you're basically funneled through the entire base game of Elden Ring, and the way you slowly see the map expand and expand while organically being able to go wherever you want. Now, it's worth noting that for a specific set of players, this weird combination of design decisions will ultimately work. I can see the explorer, the one that just enjoys the thrill of finding new locations and secrets, that methodically explores the map for traversal's sake, having a really good time here. There's enough rewards for that type of player, or the player that's looking to really experiment with all the new weapons, respec their character multiple times, and perhaps really engage with the crafting system to have fun here. The problem, of course, is that I'm not sure how big of a group that specific type of player really is. In the end, it really does feel like an odd bunch of decisions here, especially from a team like FromSoftware that's proven to really get what its players want, and have catered to a very diverse and large swath of them with things like the base game of Elden Ring and their previous titles. Now, we've kind of already mentioned how the design of Shadow of the Erdtree's map will kind of inhibit player freedom in terms of progression and where to go. But the issues with player freedom really fit into the game's updated combat system, and therefore the difficulty of the game as well. Simply put, the difficulty for Shadow of the Erdtree, and in particular its bosses, is really, really, really dependent on your build and playstyle. Much more so than the base game of Elden Ring, where Elden Ring actually provided a bunch of different ways for you to solve the issue of bosses and enemies, giving you a variety of different builds, weapons, spells, and equipment to tackle the game however you chose. Shadow of the Erdtree does something rather interesting. I'm going to go back to the source for a second here, Miyazaki, with his comments on difficulty in his games. He mentioned something really interesting with regards to Shadow of the Erdtree in an interview with CNET. In the interview, there's this part that says, "For certain bosses, Miyazaki set the challenge target for players who've tackled a majority of the base game." He said, "Which means we've kind of really pushed the envelope in terms of what we think can be withstood by the player." Reading this, it's quite clear that Miyazaki and his team at FromSoftware wanted the game to be challenging, even to the veteran players of the base game. And it's clear that the ethos of challenge and difficulty was the core principle behind designing the bosses of the game. The problems and challenges with this particular idea, just to highlight them, are fairly numerous. Certain builds are pretty powerful and broken in the base game of Elden Ring. Some players use Spirit Summons and Ashes, some don't. Some use magic, some only go melee. What FromSoftware wanted was to challenge all of those players, who are basically experts in a particular chosen style of playing that game. How do you provide challenge for such a diverse set of expert players while making the challenge feel fresh, rewarding, and most importantly, fair? Well, that's a question that I have to say FromSoftware actually failed to answer for their DLC of Shadow of the Erdtree. Depending on your build and playstyle, the bosses and enemies in the game can range from easy to crushingly, unfairly difficult. Certain build and playstyles are simply put, not viable, unless you're as skilled as a challenge run player, Ongbol, who's skilled at no damage runs on bosses, for example. And that really points to why some people are going to love the DLC's bosses and difficulty, and some will absolutely be soured by it all. If you're one of the players who uses a particularly effective build for the DLC, such as a parry build that utilizes the new hard tier, a shield turtling build, or a hybrid magic plus melee build, then you're going to have a grand time here. If you're a dex build, or you've relied on something like, say, bleed or poison, or you're a strictly melee build, then certain bosses are going to feel soul-crushingly hard. The reasons for this dichotomy go down to the core design of all the bosses in Shadow of the Erdtree. Bosses simply have extremely long combo strings, are hyper-aggressive, have near infinite stamina, and don't have many gaps between their flurry of attacks, making windows for your retaliation and punishes exceedingly small. Often, you will spend the majority of a fight dodging a flurry of ranged and melee attacks, only to be able to get 1 or 2 hits in before the cycle repeats. Thus, boss battles become long drawn-out affairs, unless you either use summons or cooperators to split the aggro, or have spells and ranged magic options to combat the boss's own ranged attacks and high speed of movement. But hey, there's another wrinkle in all of this, and that comes back to your build. If you've got a build where you can do one big attack every once in a while that does enough damage, then these battles really kind of become fun. It's a bizarre bit of design and balancing, where certain builds that were accommodated in the base game, can feel completely useless and therefore really piss off certain players or punish certain playstyles. Again, this is in stark contrast to the base game of Elden Ring, where most bosses have valid windows for you to attack and can be tackled in a variety of different ways based on a good number of diverse builds and playstyles. Let's look at an example of this, which is Malenia in the base game. She's perhaps what people consider the hardest boss. She has a flurry of attacks, 2 forms, an instant kill move, status effects, and her attacks can restore her health, and she's got a bunch of delayed attacks that take a lot of practice to dodge. Yet, despite having all of that, Malenia actually has a few really exploitable weaknesses. For one, she's more of a glass cannon, with extremely weak poise, making her easy to stagger even for builds that rely on dex. 2 status effects can really do a number on her as well. And the third thing is that she's got really low defense, and while she can clearly restore her health by attacking you, if you're high enough level, you can simply tank through her forms, avoiding a few of her deadliest attacks. Now, let's compare her to, say, Rilana, the first major boss of the DLC, and things really start to fall into place. Rilana has high poise, can spam ranged delayed magic attacks, has high defense, and has extremely long combos that can track you like crazy. She has multiple moves that can either stun lock you to death, and you need to really practice to learn how to dodge lest she quickly end you. And the windows to attack her? They're almost non-existent for a melee character. There are only 2 instances where you can really wail on her, and those happen when she's transitioning to her second phase, after she does a flurry of her fill the screen with magic attacks that can easily kill you if one of them hits you, stun locking you for the other 2 to finish you off. In essence, Rilana is harder than Malenia in a lot of ways, and she's definitely stronger. If you're a melee dex build, then you're going to have an exceedingly tough time. If you've got a shield to parry with, or trade damage with, then she becomes somewhat easier. If you've got both a ranged and melee hybrid build, then she becomes a cakewalk, as you only have to worry about 3 of her ranged attacks. And parrying just trivializes her. And it's worth noting that Rilana is one of the early bosses of the DLC. A bunch of the other bosses have the same aggression, unlimited stamina, and the ability to quickly both close the gap and get very far away from you. A lot of the enemies and bosses will also read your inputs or react to the first frame of your moves, whichever you prefer, and respond accordingly, making the game's bosses feel less like exploitable, intelligent enemies and more like systems that you have to find a way to break into. Ultimately, your mileage for all the bosses is going to vary based on what kind of build you have. Some will work great, others will punish you terribly. And to make matters worse, depending on your build, of course, there are certain attacks that are completely unavoidable, as is the case with enemies like Gaius or the dreaded final boss in Radahn. And Radahn, oh boy, is the final boss of the DLC a bundle of despair and disappointment. Things have been divisive thus far, and there's reasons for that, but Radahn, I truly believe, is something that most players will be disappointed by in at least one aspect or the other. In a lot of ways, Consort Radahn, the so-called revived prime version of Radahn that serves as the final boss in Shadow of the Erdtree, exemplifies a lot of the issues with the expansion as a whole. First, let's look at the lore and story implications of all of this, which honestly aren't all that great. The entire idea of Shadow of the Erdtree's campaign is that you're supposed to be following in a particular character's footsteps, and learning about what happened to them and why they kind of disappeared from the grand events of Elden Ring's base game. That character is Miquella the Kind, who, like his mommy Queen Marika, is actually an entity made of 2 beings, himself and his loving or kind female version in Saint Trina. Miquella goes to great lengths to enter the Shadow Realm of the DLC, charming Mohg with his powers in the base game, divesting himself slowly of almost everything he has, his physical body, his divine powers, his other self in Saint Trina, and it's all just to basically do the same thing that his mommy did in ascending to godhood and in ultimately reviving Radahn. To call this whole revelation underwhelming is putting it mildly. But hey, there's at least the tantalizing idea of fighting Radahn in his prime peak form, unlike, say, in the base game of Elden Ring, where Scarlet Rot has basically eroded his mind and left him a mindless fighting husk of his former self. Yet, as the battle and the story demonstrates, Radahn really has no personality or new-formed expressiveness. He hasn't got any dialogue like, say, Margit, Hoarah, or even Malenia. He says nothing and is nothing more than a hulking, overpowered brute that just rushes you. And if the build-up to this final boss sounds disappointing, then the actual battle itself is a backbreaker in terms of enjoyment for a lot of people. I mention a lot of people because even here, in what I'd imagine would be a battle and a boss that everyone would universally hate, there are still some people who like this boss despite his flaws. The boss, the final boss, much like the rest of the expansion, is quite a divisive thing to talk about. The first, and most divisive issue, is the fact that there are actually two versions of this boss fight, depending on when you fought him. One version was the version we got on release. This was the backbreaking version, the unfair, and I'd argue, broken version. The second version, which is available today, is a more manageable one, and was added in patch 1.14. After this patch, a bunch of the issues in the battle were either fixed or nerfed, depending on your particular perspective. And as you can expect, this change to the final boss caused quite a stir among players. Some had already beaten him and thought he was fine, while others had either refused to or were stuck on him indefinitely, and were kind of glad to see the changes. And thus, there are two sides to this particular argument of whether Consort Radahn was fine as he was, or if he needed to be nerfed or fixed. For those who liked him, they liked the high level of almost unfair challenge that Consort Radahn provided. This was and is, as they put, for all intents and purposes, the last battle that players will face in Elden Ring, given that there's no more plans for further expansions and a sequel hasn't been confirmed. So, to have that final battle be the most difficult thing you've ever faced, pushing you to the very brink of your skills, resources, and making you potentially shift your build and playstyle entirely, not only makes sense to them, but is somewhat appreciated as a challenge. See, what's interesting about FromSoftware fans, especially the ones from the base game of Elden Ring, is that they're kind of segmented into a bunch of different skill levels. There's people who don't find FromSoftware games all that challenging anymore. Once you've played a game or two of theirs, there's a general rhythm and a style to the boss encounters and the game itself that makes that sense of accomplishment that you initially felt not come out as often in your fourth, third, or second FromSoftware game. There are exceptions, like Sekiro, where FromSoftware completely changed the way their combat works, but generally speaking, FromSoftware games only get easier the more of them you play. And I'm sure that there's a large part of the veteran crowd that wants to be challenged again, that wants to feel the same sense of really surmounting a difficult challenge like they did all those games ago. Shadow of the Erdtree and the original version of Radahn is undoubtedly for those very small bunch of people. The people who likely found the base game of Elden Ring, and perhaps even games like Dark Souls 3 and Bloodborne before it, easy. To give those players, and really anyone who's played a decent swath of their games, a challenge. It's clear that Miyazaki and his team really wanted to send players off the Elden Ring experience with a big challenge. The problem, depending on once again your build and playstyle, is that this fight was either the most difficult fight you've ever played in a FromSoftware game, or an entirely frustrating, unfair affair. Certain builds, like heavy armor builds, bonk builds, and builds that use dodge gimmicks like the backstep talisman, and of course, shield builds, are likely the builds that will make this fight pretty viable. Summoning, for those who end up deciding to rely on that, even if they didn't so for the entire rest of the DLC, can actually make Radahn extremely erratic, and if you summon enough cooperators, can actually buff his health to insane levels. Again, this spits in the face of something every boss in the base game of Elden Ring allowed you to do. Tackle it in a variety of different ways depending on your playstyle and build. There were multiple valid ways to defeat Radagon, the final boss of the base game, for example. Sure, he was weak to certain elements, and things like bleed didn't affect him much, but he had spaces and windows where you could attack him. All his moves were avoidable via a basic dodge, and he had very clear telegraphs. Pre-patch, Radahn actually has a move or two that is almost impossible to dodge without some kind of gimmick or near perfect frame timing. The very basic foundations of Elden Ring's combat system, the dodging and attacking that have been true for the entire game, are thrown out the window for this one boss. And that's only for his first phase. The second phase ends up being a nightmare, with him having multiple attacks that fill the entire stage with light effects, blinding you constantly and making dodges and telegraphs hard to read or near impossible. The issue was so egregious that the patch ended up toning down and delaying some of the light effects and attacks to make it all feel a little bit more manageable. And the stamina issue that I mentioned with Rilana? Well, stamina isn't even a concept for Radahn, as the guy is basically a machine that keeps throwing out combo and attack after attack after attack randomly from any range. A lot of these attacks are very similar in how they start out, so it's actually really hard to learn the pattern of this boss, as he'll often do moves based on proximity and whether you're dodging, attacking, or healing. Roll catches, delayed attacks, super long combos, it's all here, along with massive damage, a lot of defense, and a degree of speed and movement that just feels... there's no other way to say it. It feels unfair. It definitely feels like the game Consort Radahn is playing and the game the player is playing are two different ones with different rules and different mechanics. And so, at the very least, for even some of the most skilled players, there's bound to be a lot of time spent learning and honestly memorizing how Radahn's moveset works. But hey, let's say you decide to do this, to spend the time and learn that frame perfect timing. Well, the game's performance issues will actually prevent you from getting consistent results, which just throws not only this fight, but the entire DLC into a rather unfun, unfair state. Now, while Consort Radahn was patched, leading to some of his effects and attacks being toned down, and that giving rise to better performance, it unfortunately doesn't start or stop with Radahn. The issues with slowdown and bosses are actually pretty widespread throughout the entire game of Shadow of the Erdtree. Which of course brings us to the most egregious issue with Shadow of the Erdtree, one that can't be divisive: its performance. Unless you've got a monster PC, Shadow of the Erdtree will have massive frame dips and spikes during boss battles in particular. And with how difficult and overpowered a lot of these bosses are, and how precise the game expects you to be, this just tilts an already potentially frustrating experience into throw the controller at the screen in anger territory. I played the game on console, and there were multiple bosses, whether it was the Dancing Lion, Rilana, the Scadutree avatar, or Radahn, where the frame rate for the battle would be so variable that it was impossible to learn the timing of attacks and the boss's patterns without basically learning 3 to 4 different variations of each attack at the different frame rates. The Dancing Lion, which is more than likely the first boss you'll encounter in the DLC, was the most egregious of the bunch, where I felt like I was playing the game in slow motion once he entered his second phase and the particle effects started flying everywhere. Then there's the odd performance bugs, like Renala, for instance, can have a variation in her battle where it starts raining, and I actually found that those extra particle effects on the screen would shift and slow down the frame rate of the battle. Look, this is coming from someone who's played and finished Bloodborne on PlayStation 4, who beat the entirety of the base game of Elden Ring on PlayStation 5. Shadow of the Erdtree on PlayStation 5 is absolutely unacceptable in terms of the performance issues it has, particularly during boss battles. It doesn't matter if the bosses are the most well-designed, greatest looking spectacles you've ever seen. It doesn't matter if the new mechanics and tools at your disposal are cool. For a game engine that's now 2 years old, for a game that won multiple Game of the Year awards, having performance that's worse than the base game is shockingly disappointing, despite whatever rough performance FromSoftware games have always had in the past. And it's worth noting that this doesn't affect everyone. People who have a beefy enough PC, or if you're one of the few people who played the PlayStation 4 version on the PlayStation 5, you're not gonna notice this. That said, a good chunk of the player base is at the very least on console and PS5, so it's hard to not feel slighted a bit when you're trying to get through some of FromSoftware's most challenging content and the game just chugs and chugs, throwing everything off. Is the game showing its age? Was Shadow of the Erdtree rushed out the door? Was it too ambitious? Only FromSoftware knows what the answer to all of this is. In the end, looking at all of this though, I think the divisive issues with Shadow of the Erdtree really stem from two key decisions: the focus on difficulty and the ambition of making this an expansion rather than a full-blown sequel. To reiterate, for the first time in what feels like forever, I think FromSoftware, the absolute kings of the action RPG or their own invented Soulsborne genre, bit off more than they could chew. They tried to tackle too many issues and unique problems, and had such a large player base to cater to that even they ultimately crashed and burned when it came to a sizable portion of that said player base. Now, the question is this going to be an issue going forward? And for my money, I honestly don't think so. I think this particular combination of a massive expansion pack, 2 years in the making, for one of their biggest games is likely not something that we're going to see a repeat of. In fact, Miyazaki himself has alluded to this very fact, stating in another interview with The Guardian, and I quote, "Where FromSoftware is right now, in terms of scale, I would say Elden Ring is really the limit. We've tapped every resource and talent that we have access to. Scaling it even bigger, I'd have my concerns. Perhaps having multiple projects is the next stage, where some of the younger talent can have the opportunity to manage and direct game design for a smaller project." Given that Elden Ring itself took 8 years to make, and Shadow of the Erdtree then took an additional 2 years, I'd say focusing on smaller scale projects that push the envelope in different ways rather than scale is likely the smartest move for FromSoftware, especially after Shadow of the Erdtree. I'd much rather see another Armored Core game, or a Sekiro sequel, or something along those lines, and I suspect that's what we'll be getting from FromSoftware in the future. For now, I guess we finally got an example of even the best failing to meet expectations for a change. While a good chunk of players may not even notice these issues, another chunk of them will, and will leave Shadow of the Erdtree feeling more than a little disappointed. In the end, this is really something that I want to hear from you about. If you finished this video and Shadow of the Erdtree, I really want to know what your experience was like. Which of the two camps did you fall into? Why did you feel the way you did? Let's discuss it at length in the comments, as I think this is one of 2024's most divisive and interesting game releases.